and you have the phone. Oh, love
just for you, just for you.
Thank you so much, Laura. We slid a bit in terms of timing, so it's all yours. Well, I'm so glad to see you. Just let me know when to launch the slides. I remember you wanted them a bit later than the beginning.
Thank you, Artem. To everyone, I am so happy to be here and so delighted to share with you some thoughts about how traditional stories can be highly effective in building relationships, solving problems, and connecting both in the workplace and in our personal lives. So, Artem, if you could start the slides, please.
Thank you for being here, and I'm off.
Okay. All righty. Oh, there we go. So what I'm going to be talking about today is exactly what the slides say. I'll be sharing some stories about heroes and helpers, light and dark, and how we can use these traditional stories to maybe smooth the way sometimes when things are difficult, both in our workplaces and in our personal lives. A little bit about me. I have over 30 years of storytelling experience. I have been doing organizational work for over 20 years through thinkstory.com. And my background is in folklore, so my degree is in folklore and mythology. When I'm in organizations, I am judicious about how I use traditional stories, but I find more and more often traditional stories give me a way to talk about difficult things and shed a little light on the subject without making anyone feel defensive. So they're a great way to slide in there and open up the floor to having a real conversation about important things without anyone feeling as though you're attacking them personally. So I'm going to share some of those stories with you and tell you a little bit about how I do it. And I hope that you can use this in your own work and your own life. So this is often how we like to think of ourselves at work. We are intense and intellectual and technological and driven. And we can be all of those things. But as Rain talked about in the prior presentation, when we do that, we are disconnecting ourselves from our whole selves. And when we bring our whole selves into an experience, we're much more likely to be able to really connect and really create change. This is who we really are. We are far more people who gather in community around a fire, around that light in the darkness. Artem, I'm trying to bring light into the darkness as much as I can here. But when we do that, we can share stories. We can connect on both an intellectual and an emotional level. And traditional stories sometimes give us a way to share who we are or share solutions in the moment that might not be so easy to get to if we're actually direct. So why use these stories in modern times? Well, first off, these stories are everywhere. We all grew up with these metaphors, with an understanding of how metaphor works. The world's religions use metaphor and story to teach how we should live. So it's a language that we already have, and these stories are highly accessible. They're tried and tested. They've been around for centuries, if not millennia. So just because we think of ourselves as modern people, it doesn't mean that we are not still very much like our ancestors generations ago. Our hearts are still the same. Our needs are still the same. Our hunger for connection is still the same. And finally, these stories are community property. So while you might tell your own story or someone else's story, these stories, you don't have to worry about violating someone's sense of ownership if you share one of them. These stories are just there for us to use because they are part of what it is to be human. So why tell stories with darkness in them when we are actively trying to create more light with our stories? Well, darkness is. We all go through dark times. We all have difficulties. We all struggle sometimes. These stories tell us that it is possible to survive darkness. Now, traditional stories about surviving darkness, sometimes the character doesn't survive, but somebody did. Somebody survived to create this story, to create this metaphor, to come up with a way of saying, here's some rotten stuff that can happen. Here's what you should or maybe shouldn't do. So these are stories that by their very nature, by their very existence, tell us that survival of darkness, surviving in the darkness and finding light again, is possible. These stories also often tell us that you can't survive darkness by yourself. In the West, we love the metaphor of the lone hero, the lone cowboy, but none of that exists. We all exist in community. And these stories remind us that we survive darkness by looking for help, by finding helpers and finding community. So over the course of this talk, I'm going to share with you some of these stories and give you some examples of how I've used them. And this is the first set of stories that I want to share. Gilgamesh, as you know, is our oldest known myth. It's the oldest written myth that we have. And Gilgamesh is a rotten king. His people cry out for help, and the gods send him someone who humbles him, Enkidu. And he and Enkidu ultimately become friends and have adventures together. In the course of their adventures, Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh is laid low by grief. And it is through these experiences that Gilgamesh becomes a better king, becomes a more compassionate being, and is able to become the kind of ruler that his subjects don't revile. This story teaches us that change is possible, that grief is common and human and something we all will experience, that death is unavoidable, but we can learn something from the deaths of those we love. King Solomon and the Baby, and I'm sure you know all these stories I'm referring to. King Solomon and the Baby is a story about the wise King Solomon, who solved many, many problems. And one day, two women come to him with one child, each claiming that that child is theirs. And King Solomon tries to think of a way to solve this problem and finally lands on the idea of proposing that he cut the child in half, and thinking that whoever really loves the baby will be willing to give up the baby so it survives. And that's in fact what happens. The woman who's not really the child's mother says, yeah, sure, cut the kid in half, I'll take half. The child's mother says, no, it's more important to me that he survive than that he be mine. This is a rough story. This is a story that tugs at our heartstrings because we all want what we want. And if you've had children, you can feel that visceral terror at the thought of your child being harmed. But this story teaches us that we can actually find ways to the truth, that we can find ways to identify who is more deserving. And it's useful in organizational settings because it helps us think about what we might be willing to sacrifice to come to the best solution for everyone. Room for One More is one that I'm sure you know, about a man who lives in an itty bitty little house with his wife, his children, and grandchildren. And it's loud and congested, and he's just going kind of nuts. So he goes to a wise person and asks for help. And that wise person says, bring in your cow, bring in your goats, bring in your chickens. And so now the house is unbelievably congested and loud and aromatic. And eventually the wise person says, take each of these out one by one, the chickens and the cow and the goats. And by the time it's done, his house seems huge. The story teaches us that we may be in difficult situations, but our perspective really matters. I'll come back to the blind man and the elephant. Godfather Death is a story about a boy who has the death as his godfather and is given many gifts, but ultimately still dies. So organizationally, that tells us that some things are inevitable and that how we move through the world while we're here matters. I'm going to take a moment and tell you the story of the blind man and the elephant and give you an example of when I used it organizationally. I love all these metaphors, and I hope you're enjoying them too. There once was a village where there lived 3 blind men. Now, these men were friends. They helped each other. They guided each other through the world. Their survival was interdependent. One day, someone brought an elephant to the village, and everyone was talking about it, how magnificent it was. And the blind men wanted to experience the elephant for themselves. So someone led them to the elephant. The first blind man was placed at the elephant's trunk, and he felt the trunk and said, oh, an elephant is like a pipe. The second blind man was placed at the elephant's side, and he put up his hands and felt the elephant's side and said, an elephant is like a wall. And the third blind man was placed at the elephant's rear, and he felt the elephant's tail and said, an elephant is like a rope. sometimes organizationally, I will stop the story there because the metaphor is pretty clear that different people can experience the same thing in different ways. But if things are difficult, as they were when I told this story in an organization I was consulting with, I'll go on. The blind men were brought back together, and they each excitedly talked about their experience of the elephant, and each one was convinced that they knew the totality of the elephant. So soon they were fighting and arguing, and their friendship dissolved, and they no longer had each other's support. They no longer helped each other move through the world, all because they were unwilling to admit that an elephant might be more than just a pipe or a wall or a rope. I was brought in to do some story work in an organization where they were having great internal conflict, great internal troubles. And I used this story as a way to help everyone there see that each group was seeing only one small part of the problem. If I had said to each group, you're only seeing one bit of the problem, you really need to see bigger, they would have gotten defensive. They would have put up walls. But by sharing a story with a metaphor, they were instead able to listen to each other a little more thoroughly and examine the problem from multiple points of view. That's why I love these traditional stories for organizational work and personal work. I'm sure those of you with multiple children can imagine a time when this story might come in handy. Now, many traditional stories have heroes and helpers, and we all have the capacity to be both. So I'm going to again share some quick stories with you that you might use. Heroes. I love stories where the hero is sly and not necessarily solving problems through violence. So I have 3 examples of those stories for you. The Mighty Tailor, also known as 7 at One Blow, is about a tailor who one day smacked down 7 flies at once. He was so pleased with himself that he made himself a belt that said 7 killed at one blow, and he wore that belt everywhere and set off to have adventures. He encountered a giant who was very impressed with him that he could kill 7 giants with one blow. He eventually met a king who was frightened of him and gave him tasks to prove himself, and eventually became a great ruler himself, all because he reframed an experience and then found a way to use that reframed experience really cleverly. Tatterhood is a story about 2 children born to a queen who is hungry to have children. One of her daughters is beautiful and passive. The other, when she's born, comes out wild and rambunctious, and in fact, it is born riding a goat and waving a wooden spoon in the air. The 2 sisters are inseparable. They help each other in innumerable ways and eventually have many adventures that lead them to a kingdom where the king falls in love with the beautiful sister. She says she will marry him only if the prince will marry her sister Tatterhood, who is, of course, the wild one on the goat with the spoon, who is always dressed in rags. And the prince isn't happy about this at all. As they're riding to their wedding, the king and the beautiful sister in front and the prince and Tatterhood behind, Tatterhood looks at him and sees the sour expression on his face and suggests that he ask her why she ride a goat. So he does. Why do you ride a goat? He asks. Is it a goat? She replies, and the goat has turned into a horse, a fine horse. Why are you dressed in rags? Are these rags? And she's wearing a lovely gown. Why do you carry a spoon? Is it a spoon? And it becomes a bejeweled scepter. Now, I love this story for many personal reasons, but organizationally, this story has been very helpful with me when I'm talking about the power of loyalty and the power of asking the right question and not assuming the answers before you ask that question. I need a sip of water. Would you excuse me for a minute of juice? I'm sorry, my voice is going. The allergies are very bad here. Thank you. Finally, under heroes, we have the enchanted pig. Thank you for your patience as I cleared my lungs. The Enchanted Pig is a Romanian story about a princess who ends up really not wanting to, but does marry a pig, an enormous pig. It's a Beauty and the Beast story. And it turns out he's a pig during the day and a man at night, and she tries to break the spell and fails miserably. and goes off. Hold on. I'm so sorry. I'm really sorry. She goes off in search of her beloved once the spell fails to be broken. And in her quest for him, she has to find help. She gets help from a blacksmith and from 3 old women, all of whom give her what she needs to be able to finally free the prince from his imprisonment. They marry and they live happily ever after. I found this story useful in difficult situations organizationally because it's about starting out with a really rotten problem, marrying a pig, and seeing what happens if you treat that problem creatively and let yourself accept help and listen to your elders, listen to those who are wise around you. All of these stories have helped me in organizations. Helper stories are another great way to get help to share, or other great stories to share in organizations. A Pottle of Brains is a British story about a boy who is as dumb as a box of rocks, and his mother wants him to become wise. So to please her, he goes and asks a wise woman if she'll give him brains. She says she'll help him if he can bring her the heart of the thing he loves most. Well, he loves bacon, so he brings the heart of a pig, which is not the right answer. When he goes home, he finds that his mother is ill and she dies, and his heart is broken with grief. So he realizes the thing that he loves most is his mother. So he wraps her up and brings her to the wise woman, who says, no, that's not it. You should probably bury your mother. But if you can answer this riddle, I'll help you. And the riddle is what runs without feet, which he can't answer. He buries his mother. He goes home. He eventually marries the girl next door with whom he's been friends for many years. And she is smart and clever, and they grow to love each other very much. So he brings her to see the wise woman, the thing he loves the most. And the wise woman smiles when he sees him with his wife. And she asks him 3 riddles, and his wife whispers the answers to him. He then says, well, could I have a pottle of brains? And his wife says, no. You already have it. Your wife is wise, and you are strong, and you will do well together. I found this story useful in organizations because it's about building on the talents and skills that you already have and accepting the help that you can find around you, and maybe not trying too hard to answer a question without asking someone else, because really, who wants the heart of a pig on their desk at 9 a.m. Monday morning? Puss in Boots is a story I'm sure you all know about a boy who has a very clever cat which helps him marry up and become wise and rich. All of these stories I've used organizationally. I will get to what kind of organization and when can you use these stories in a little bit. I promise I'm not going to forget that. But all of these stories can be very effective when told at the right time in the right place. There are also stories of community, and these are probably my favorite kinds of stories to tell organizationally. Holding Up the Sky is a lovely short little story about a hummingbird that's lying on the ground with her feet pointing to the sky. An elephant comes by and asks why she's doing that, and she says, I heard the sky's going to fall. And the elephant laughs and says, well, what difference are your tiny feet going to make? And the hummingbird replies, I'm doing what I can. Sometimes the story ends there. Other times, the elephant walks down the road and finally rolls over and holds her own feet up to the sky. And together, they keep the sky from falling. I'm sure you can hear the metaphor in that quite easily. Stone Soup, I'm sure you know it. It's a story about collectively making a pot of amazing soup if everybody adds ingredients. The Rooster Prince is a really funny and not very well-known story about a prince who is so disgusted by all the corruption he sees in his kingdom that he decides to become a rooster. He sheds his clothes, he hides under the table, and will eat only grain. His father calls all kinds of people to try and heal him, and none of them can, until a wise man comes who sheds his clothes and pretends he's a rooster along with the prince. And then the wise man asks for a pair of pants. The Rooster Prince says, why are you wearing pants? And the wise man says, who says roosters can't wear pants? He asks for a shirt. Who says roosters can't wear a shirt and shoes and sit at a table and eat with a fork and knife and speak like everyone else does. And the prince, who is gradually restored to himself, eventually becomes a great and compassionate leader. And I love that story because it allows for differences in how we all think. And it says that we can be who we are in the moment. And sometimes that might actually be a better outcome. And finally, music and light fill the barn. And I will tell that one to you briefly. There was once a farmer who had 3 daughters whom he loved. As he grew old, he began to worry about them endlessly because he knew his land wasn't enough to support 3 daughters and 3 husbands and children that might come from those marriages. So he struggled to decide how to give his land to his girls, until finally he said to them, "This land isn't enough to support all of you and your families when I pass on. So I will leave the land to whichever one of you can fill the barn best." And so his daughters agree. The next weekend, the eldest brought them all to the barn on Friday, and she pushed open the barn doors, and chaff, the hulls of wheat and grains, rose up with the air from the barn doors opening. And for a moment, it filled the barn. But as soon as the breeze stopped, the chaff all settled down again, and the farmer nodded. The girl and her sisters cleaned up all of the chaff, and the next day, on Saturday, the middle daughter brought them all to the barn and pushed open the doors, and feathers rose up and filled the barn and then settled down again. Well, the middle daughter and her sisters cleaned up the feathers and put them back into the pillows and comforters. And then on Sunday, the youngest daughter brought them all to the barn. When she pushed open the doors, nothing happened. But she pulled a candle out of her pocket and lit it. That thin light from the candle was in no way enough to fill the barn. But then she took 3 more candles out of her pockets, gave one to each of her sisters and one to her father, and led them each to a corner of the barn and lit the candles. And now the barn was full of light almost to the rafters. And she began to sing the lullaby that her mother had sang to her and her sisters joined in, and so too did the farmer. And now the barn was full of music and light. And when the song stopped, it seemed as though the music hung in the air. The sisters gathered together, laughing and talking. The farmer joined them. They blew out their candles and walked back out into the world. And the farmer thought of what he had saw. Yes, the youngest filled the barn with music and light, but they had all helped each other and cared for each other when they needed it. And his heart rested easy that when he left this world, his daughters would find a way. I love that story. And that story has been very useful when I'm trying to help people think of creative solutions and think of ways that they can support each other. So how can you do this? How can you bring light through sharing traditional stories in organizational settings, in your own lives, in your families, and in your communities? Well, you can ask people to tell you stories that they think might be appropriate and listen to what they have to say. You can offer to share a story, and I'd suggest that you try something like this. You know, the problem that we're having actually reminds me of this folktale. Do you mind if I tell it with you? It might seem a little silly, but just listen. Maybe it will help. And then share the story with them, or even say something like, "Gosh, this really reminds me of that story about the blind man and the elephant. You know that one, right?" And then if someone says no, you have a chance to share the story. Listen to their responses, listen to what they say, and ask them if there are other metaphors that might help in this situation. And then share those experiences with others so they know that sharing these kinds of stories still has value in this busy technological world, that we still need the stories that we can share around the fireside. If we can do this, if we can listen to each other, if we can share stories that matter to us, if we can use the tools that we already have in traditional story, in metaphor, well, then we can't help but come together. And when we come together, we each bring our own little flickering flame of light that will grow and grow and grow until finally we have at least as much light as there is from a lighthouse, and maybe even more. When we connect with one another, when we listen and are kind, that's how we can change the world. And stories give us a way to do that without necessarily flinching because someone is too blunt. Traditional tales, they've been building bridges for a really long time. They're tools that we can use, and I would urge you to give it a shot. I have various products and things that you can find on my websites. I'm the author of From Audience to Zeal, the ABCs of Finding, Crafting, and Telling a Great Story. On my website, laurapacker.com or thinkstory.com, you can sign up for a free 20-minute consultation, and I really hope you will. I'd love to have a chance to talk with you. You can find me in all of these places, although I made a typo, so it should be laura@laurapacker.com, not tlaurapacker.com. And I hope that you found this useful and interesting. If I can serve you in any way, please don't hesitate to get in touch. It would be my honor to spend some time with you. Share your stories. Share your light. I can't wait to see what you do. That's what I got, Artem.
Oh, that was perfect. Some tales that you've brought, I knew them. Some tales were new to me. So thank you so much for such a diversity. I'm leaving the links in the chat. And while we're waiting for the questions from the audience, if you have any, here's one from me. In the last bit, you shared how we can cue these traditional tales. But my thought is that, for example, a person next to you is stuck in seeing that he is right. And if you say, well, this reminds me of the blind man and the elephant, even if he doesn't know this folk tale, which honestly, it's a very well-told tale, he might know it. But even if he doesn't, you tell it to him and then he says, no, that's not how it is. It's totally different. What do we do in such cases when there's no connection?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things that I have done. When I have time, I will say, okay, well, I invite you to think about it. And when we meet next, tell me what you think about that story and tell me if you've seen any examples of anything like this in your life. So if there's time, I will encourage that person to go away and think about it. And most of the time, not always, but most of the time, they'll come back and they'll say, all right, I see what you're saying, but I still don't really get any other points of view in this. And if the door is opened even that much, then I can say, I totally get that. So let's imagine some other points of view. And then we can imagine them together. And even if they still are determined that they're right, if they admit that there might be another point of view and then they try their way and it doesn't work as well as they might want, then you can say, can we try this and just see what happens? So the story ends up being just a tiny little wedge. Now, if someone is bound and determined to never, ever change their mind, you and I both know that very little will do that. Speaking to them directly won't get them to change their mind. It'll just make them defensive. Sharing a story won't do it. But if you can get them to just be open to the idea that maybe there's another perspective, that can help. Another way that you can do that is, although it's not a traditional story, but if you can get people to share something personal that there might be overlap with, then at least you can start to recognize that the other perspectives that you don't agree with are still valid. So as an example, my neighbor down the street has political views that I find repulsive, right? I find his political views to be just awful. And I was sure that if ever I met him, I would at best just turn and walk away. Well, last summer, a tree came down in the neighborhood and it pulled down a bunch of power lines. So we all lost power. And we were all out there looking at the tree and waiting for the power company to come. And this guy was there standing near me. And he said, man, that's a shame. It was a beautiful tree.
Aww.
And all of a sudden, we had this common ground of trees. And so we were able to start talking about trees. And then I met him at another neighborhood event, and he knows my politics, but we were able to have a conversation. And I was able to say, hey, our conversation about trees really made me interested in trying to help preserve trees. Would you like to do this with me? And so we started this small effort to try and preserve some neighborhood trees. Now, I, of course, hope that he will come around to my way of thinking around environmentalism, which is highly unlikely. And he's probably hoping I'll come around to his way of thinking, which is also highly unlikely. But at least we can be neighbors and treat each other with respect now. So this is not about traditional stories, but even so, finding that tiny little bridge of a story about a tree made a big difference.
Mm-hmm. That is true.
And I've seen that happen organizationally. I worked in for an international insurance company, and they had recently hired a bunch of people in a company on the other side, a country on the other side of the world. Most people were based in the U.S., and the people in the U.S. were hostile towards the other people. So I got them to start sharing stories about their families, and all of a sudden they became people. And I also asked them each to share a bedtime story that they might share with their children. And so that was how I brought traditional narrative into it. And they loved the stories that they each shared. It made them more human to each other.
That's an interesting piece. I mean, when you connect the personal story to the traditional story to the person of the teller, it instantly becomes personal. So, yeah, I love it. Great advice. Sharing traditional folk tales you would normally speak at bedtime is totally safe, but then again, there's potential for finding this small middle ground you've been talking about.
Yeah.
Wow, I have an idea about an exercise I'm gonna do next, because to be honest, I'm always very skeptical about telling traditional tales. But when you tell them, and when Annette Simmons told them in the recording we did, it's on another level. You believe in them so much. I guess that's why they work so well.
I'm sure that's part of it. And I think part of it, of course, is you have to be careful about where you do this. I am more likely to use traditional stories in a setting, in an organization that is already a little softer to begin with, like a nonprofit or something like that. But I've used them traditionally with engineers too. I didn't start off with that. Part of it is about establishing trust in you, trust in myself. So I need to demonstrate to them that I understand their problems, and I'm treating them all like adults, and we're all going to share stories, and we're going to see what we can learn from those, and we'll gather data from them and all that stuff. But once I've established that I am not just a nice day off with pizza for lunch, that I'm actually offering something meaningful, then I can sometimes work in these traditional stories and people will open up. Oh yeah, my dad told me that story. And you can find common ground that you wouldn't find otherwise.
Love it. Love the connection that you're talking about, like finding the middle ground, which is a very territorial metaphor. And that's a great link to what Paul Costello is bringing right after you. But before we do, I still have one more question. Laura, a lighthouse guides us in the darkness, but a chain of lighthouses can guide us in outside of the dangerous waters overall. So what story would you like more people to tell, just like, to have more lighthouses shining this light?
So I've been thinking about that. And you know me, my first answer will always be that we actually should listen to each other's stories and listen deeply. I mean, you know me and listening. But what I think, the kinds of stories that I think can really help us connect are sharing stories of something meaningful to us. That could be a traditional story. For me, it would be a traditional story. The hummingbird story that I shared about the hummingbird and the elephant. I love that story. That's one that I might share about how we each have the capacity to create change. But also just sharing a story that's meaningful to you. How did you meet your spouse? Why is your child named this? These stories that, again, break down barriers and remind us all that we all have common ground, even if we may seem wildly different.
And it doesn't matter what is meaningful to us as long as we tell stories about something meaningful to us.
Something that's authentic to us. Yeah, because frankly, even if so Rain shared a story about boxing. I don't give two shakes about boxing, but the story was meaningful because it mattered to Rain and because the message that he included with it was very powerful. And so as long as we're willing to just listen to what someone else says, doesn't matter if the story is about something that you don't care about. If you listen as human to human, you will find meaning and connection. And then you pass that on, and you take that story and you share it with the next lighthouse, or share your own story with the next lighthouse.
Love it. Laura, thank you so much. A
Thank
great
you.
adage to this conference. I like how the personal story of Rain you took from it and translated it into something from traditional tales, keeping it meaningful. Friends, let's give Laura our fires from all our hearts. Thank you so much. Please feel free to
Thank you all.
stay and
Yeah, I will.
listen to
Yeah.
the rest.
Yeah.
Ooh, it was lovely.
Thank you. Bye. Take care, everybody.
All right, we'll be moving on, and I already teased what the next speaker is talking about.